Ever feel like, city council meetings, they're important, but who has time to, like, sit through hours of that, right?
It's a lot, yeah.
But you're in luck because we do.
That's what's got to do it.
So we got the minutes from two Springfield City Council meetings from August this year, the 13th and the 27th. And let me tell you, these things are juicy.
Oh, yeah. They are like little gold mines of local drama, but also like really important stuff that affects people's everyday lives, you know?
Exactly. This is like getting straight to the source, no more wondering what your council member is thinking. This is it.
Raw transcript of democracy in action.
Love it. Okay, so immigration debates, homelessness crisis, even how they're spending your tax dollars. We're diving into all of it. You ready?
Let's do it. I'm ready if you are.
Okay, let's start with immigration, because, wow, that's a hot topic everywhere these days, but especially in Springfield.
Yeah, and you can really see that playing out in the minutes from both meetings. A community kind of wrestling with these big questions.
Yeah, like what does it mean for us here in Springfield, you know?
Exactly. And we see both sides of that coin, too.
Yeah.
So you've got people like Mr. Babian from the August 13th meeting advocating for welcoming newcomers. But then in the same meeting, you have Ms. Stanley, who's concerned about how quickly things are changing.
Right, and it's not just theoretical either. In the August 27th meeting, we heard from Ms. Foley about creating a shared future with newcomers. And then you have Mr. Higgers, who led that anti-immigration march a few weeks back. He's worried about cultural shifts and resources, being stretched too thin.
And that's the thing about local government. You're dealing with these national issues, but on a very personal level.
So how did the council respond to all this?
Well, in that August 13th meeting, the council president, Mr. Rue, he actually addresses it head on, even mentions a community forum hosted by the NAACP to discuss all this.
Okay, so at least they're acknowledging it. But what about concrete actions?
He mentions the city's looking for funding for things like language services for first responders.
Practical stuff.
Exactly. It's a small step, but it shows they're thinking about the practicalities.
And in that August 27th meeting, he talked about those sample letters encouraging residents to contact state and federal officials.
Which makes sense because a lot of immigration policies decided at those higher levels.
Right. It's not just a local issue. But speaking of local, it was interesting how much discussion there was about driving. In the August 27th meeting, Mr. Rue talked about doing a 30-day blitz to emphasize Ohio driving laws. Seems a little random.
Maybe, but then you think back to the August 13th meeting, and Ms. Plant specifically brought up concerns about driving violations.
And let's not forget Mr. Harris and Mrs. Hayes in the August 27th meeting. They were pretty vocal about their concerns. This blitz could be the council's way of saying, hey, we hear you and we're doing something.
Exactly. Whether it's effective or not, that remains to be seen, but it's definitely a response to what they're hearing from the community.
Okay, so we've got immigration, but then there's homelessness, and that's another issue that just jumps out from these minutes.
It's heartbreaking, especially the stuff from the August 13th meeting with the executive in closing.
So many people without a place to go.
You really hear the desperation from the advocates like Mrs. Bailey, Mrs. Jackson, and Mrs. Bradley. They're pleading for the city to do something to help these people. And then you have residents like Mr. Medic and Mrs. Knoll who are scared. They don't feel safe in their own neighborhoods.
It's a tough situation all around, and it really highlights how these issues, they're not just statistics, they impact real people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But before we get into the city's response, let's back up for a second. Why did the executive inn close in the first place?
Good question. The August 13th minutes mention a proposed contract with Homeful, that organization. They do a lot of work with homelessness.
I think so, yeah.
Well, it seems like they were going to run the executive inn, maybe some kind of shelter.
Okay.
But the council voted it down. Yeah, and the minutes don't really get into the why,
Yeah.
but the contract was voted down. So no operator, no shelter, right, leaves the executive inn kind of hanging, which I guess is why they eventually had to close it. So what happened? Did the city just wash their hands of the whole situation?
Not exactly. City manager Mr. Heck actually addressed this in the August 27th meeting. Said they were kind of caught off guard when the Homeful deal fell through.
Okay, so scrambling to find solutions.
Yeah, it seems like they're trying to find places for the people who were living in the executive inn, but, that's a temporary fix.
Band-Aids on a bigger problem.
Exactly. And speaking of bigger problems, we've talked about the Villager Inn fire, right?
Yeah, that was awful.
Well, it turns out the damage was so bad they had to demolish the whole building. And get this, during the August 27th meeting, the finance director, Ms. Evaston, said the city got a $360,000 insurance payout, but they tried to find a developer to rebuild, make it into affordable housing, and nobody wanted it.
Oh, wow. So now they've got this money but nowhere to use it.
Right. It's like a whole other layer to this housing crisis.
So frustrating. But the city must be doing something right to address this whole homelessness situation.
They are.
Yeah.
It's hard to tell how much from the minutes, but Mr. Heck did say city staff are working on placing people from the executive in. And remember, in the August 13th meeting, we heard from Ms. Durnell. She's a housing manager with the Ohio Industrial Commission, and she said they're helping too.
Okay, so at least it sounds like there's some coordination there, but that still feels very much like dealing with the symptoms, not the cause. So is anyone talking about long-term solutions?
They are. Both Mrs. Houston and Mrs. Tackett brought it up in the August 27th meeting, said the city needs a real plan to address homelessness. But they didn't get into specifics.
So the million-dollar question is, will they actually do it?
Right. Actions speak louder than words.
Totally. And it's like we were saying before, this isn't just about finding people a place to sleep right now. Homelessness, it's tied to so many other things. Poverty, lack of health care, mental health.
Absolutely. You have to address those root causes if you want to make a real difference.
For sure. Okay, well, speaking of complex issues, let's talk about everyone's favorite topic.
Money, the root of all evil.
Aha, right. But seriously, these city council minutes are like a crash course in municipal finance.
They really are.
Yeah.
I never thought I'd be so interested in rock salt bids.
But you know what? It's fascinating to see how the city budgets for everything. Totally. And it's not always pretty. Remember Mrs. Phillips in the August 13th meeting? She had some pointed questions about that villager in insurance money.
Yeah, she definitely wanted to make sure things are being handled above board.
Transparency is key. But to be fair to the city, Mrs. Evaston did give a pretty detailed explanation of the whole villager inn situation.
She did. Even explained why they couldn't rebuild on that site. So at least they're trying to be more upfront about things, even when it's not the most positive news.
Right, like nobody wants to hear about utility rate increases.
Nobody. But you know what? At least Mrs. Evaston explained why they were necessary. Rising material costs, upgrades to the water treatment plant. Makes you understand it's not just some arbitrary decision.
It's all connected.
Exactly. And speaking of connected, we got to talk about this whole sidewalk, curb, and gutter program. They spent a lot of time on that.
Bonds, assessments, property taxes, my eyes were glazing over.
Mine too, a little bit.
Yeah.
But basically, the city is taking out bonds to pay for this program up front, and then they'll use property taxes to pay back the bonds over time.
Okay, so like a loan.
Yeah, exactly. A loan for sidewalks.
Who knew? But it does make sense. Although I did appreciate Mr. Selig's question in the August 27th meeting about what happens to people who can't afford those extra assessments on their property taxes.
It's a good question, and it sounds like they've got it covered. Mrs. Evaston said the assessments will just be added to people's property tax bills.
Handled by the county auditor.
Right, so it's all above board and accounted for.
Well, that's good to know. It really seems like the city is walking this tightrope, trying to keep essential services running, keep costs down for residents, but then also making these big investments in infrastructure.
It's a balancing act for sure. And that's where these grants and external funding sources come in.
Which brings us to the water supply revolving loan account. Sound boring, but it could be huge for Springfield.
Right. I mean, it's a loan, but the Ohio EPA could forgive a big chunk of it. And the rest is interest-free.
Free money.
Pretty much. And that means they can finally do those water infrastructure upgrades they've been talking about forever. Lead lines especially. Got to get rid of those.
For sure. And then there's that Safe Streets and Roads for All grant. Sounds like that one's coming from the U.S. Department of Transportation.
That's the one. And it's a biggie. They're talking about some serious intersection upgrades.
Making those roads safer, which I think we can all appreciate.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting to see how all these different levels of government kind of come together. You've got local, state, even federal agencies all playing a role.
Totally. It's all connected.
It is. And, one more thing that caught my eye was the city's contract with this group, Grow America.
Oh, yeah. They're going to help the city with grant administration, right?
Exactly. Because applying for these federal grants, it's not easy. There's a lot of paperwork, a lot of regulations. So Grow America is basically going to be like their grant guru.
Makes sense. Especially if they're planning on going after more of that sweet, sweet grant money.
Right. Got to spend money to make money, as they say.
Words to live by.
Yeah.
Well, I got to say, after spending all this time with these city council minutes, I feel like I actually understand what's going on in Springfield.
Me too. It's
Hmm.
amazing what you can learn from these things.
Right, and it just goes to show you these meetings, they might seem boring, but they really matter.
They do. Because it's not just about the decisions being made, it's about the process.
Yeah,
It's about hearing from the community and trying to find solutions that work for everyone.
exactly. So to everyone listening, if you've ever complained about something going on in your town, well, this is your reminder that you have a voice.
Go to those city council meetings, make your voice heard,
Write to your council member.
get involved,
Yes, because at the end of the day, this is your city,
your community.
your responsibility.
Okay, maybe responsibility is a little strong, but you get the idea.
I do, I do. Well, on that note, I think we've done our civic duty for today.
I'd say so. Until next time, Springfield.
Stay curious and stay engaged.